Sometimes, a single moment of arrogance can erase a lifetime of power, but only after the truth decides to speak. Officer Ethan Brooks had spent nearly 2 decades believing one thing above all else. The badge on his chest placed him above questions. It wasn't written in any police manual, nor spoken aloud inside the precinct, but it had quietly become the rule he lived by. Every traffic stop, every confrontation, every order barked at frightened strangers reinforced the same dangerous illusion, that authority belonged to him and dignity belonged only to those he chose to recognize. On that humid evening in Washington, D.C., the marble steps leading toward the nation's highest court shimmered beneath the fading light of sunset. Tourists drifted away with cameras hanging from their shoulders. Reporters packed away microphones after another long day covering constitutional arguments that most Americans would never fully understand. The city seemed ready to exhale, but justice had not finished writing its story. Far below the towering columns, a woman dressed in a charcoal gray coat walked alone across the plaza. She carried no visible symbol of status. No security detail surrounded her. No flashing vehicles waited nearby. In one hand rested a worn leather briefcase. In the other, a slim folder marked only with a faded blue tab. Her pace was steady, almost meditative, as though she had walked this path hundreds of times without needing anyone to notice. Her name was Naomi Carter. To passing strangers, she looked like another attorney finishing a long day. To Ethan Brooks, she looked like someone who didn't belong. He noticed her from across the security barricade and frowned before he even knew why. Years of unchecked assumptions had trained his instincts more effectively than any academy ever had. He watched her approach, his jaw tightening as she calmly stepped toward the restricted entrance that had already been cleared for authorized personnel. "Hey!" His voice cut through the quiet plaza. Several pedestrians instinctively turned. Naomi stopped. She faced him without alarm, without irritation, without fear. Ethan strode toward her with heavy, deliberate steps, each one echoing against the polished stone beneath his boots. His expression carried the confidence of a man who had never expected to be challenged. Identification. His tone wasn't a request. Naomi met his eyes. "I have authorization to enter." The answer was calm, measured, almost gentle. Something about her composure irritated him more than open defiance ever could. "I didn't ask what you have," Ethan replied sharply. "I asked for identification." Around them, conversation slowed. A pair of interns paused near the fountain. 2 journalists exchanged uncertain glances before quietly lifting their phones. Security cameras mounted high above continued recording without emotion, capturing every movement beneath the evening sky. Naomi slowly reached toward her briefcase. Ethan immediately stepped forward. "Don't!" The single word cracked through the air. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist before she could unzip the bag. Gasps rippled across the plaza. The folder slipped from Naomi's fingers, scattering neatly organized documents across the stone walkway as a soft breeze carried several pages toward the courthouse steps. For the first time, silence settled over everyone watching. Naomi looked down at the papers, then back at Ethan. There was no panic in her face, no pleading, only a quiet disappointment that seemed strangely heavier than anger. "You should let go," she said softly. Ethan laughed under his breath. "You people always think the rules don't apply." The words hung in the air like smoke. Several witnesses lowered their eyes. Others continued recording. No one intervened. The evening sun disappeared behind the government buildings, leaving long shadows stretching across the plaza. Somewhere in the distance, church bells announced the coming hour, their solemn echoes drifting through the Capitol. Ethan tightened his grip. He believed the crowd saw an officer maintaining order. He believed another routine confrontation was unfolding exactly as it should. He believed tomorrow would be just another shift. He could not see the approaching black SUVs several blocks away. He could not hear the urgent radio transmissions suddenly flooding secure government channels. He could not imagine that before the next sunrise, every complaint buried inside his personnel file would be reopened. Every camera angle would be examined. Every word he had just spoken would be replayed across the nation, and the badge he trusted more than his own conscience would become the very evidence that destroyed everything he had spent 20 years building. Because the woman standing silently before him was never powerless, and dawn was already on its way. 6 hours earlier, before the confrontation that would ignite headlines across the nation, Washington carried the quiet confidence of a city accustomed to power. The streets surrounding the Supreme Court were already alive with disciplined movement. Clerks hurried through security gates carrying stacks of legal briefs. Reporters rehearsed their opening lines beneath white marble columns. Tour buses unloaded visitors who paused only long enough to admire the architecture before disappearing toward Capitol Hill. Everything appeared orderly, predictable, permanent. Yet beneath that polished surface, another story was quietly unfolding. Imagine walking into a place where every face seems to measure whether you truly belong before you even speak a word. Imagine knowing that no title, no achievement, and no lifetime of sacrifice can completely erase the assumptions carried in someone else's mind. That invisible weight was one Justice Naomi Carter had learned to carry decades ago. She arrived without ceremony. No muuterkath, no flashing lights, no cameras following her every step. She preferred it that way. A simple charcoal coat rested neatly over a navy dress. Comfortable shoes replaced expensive heels. Her silver hair was pulled back with quiet elegance, framing a face shaped not only by age, but by years of impossible decisions. She carried herself with remarkable calm, the kind earned only after spending a lifetime listening before speaking. To strangers, she looked like an experienced attorney nearing retirement. Very few would have guessed that she was one of the most respected voices ever to sit on the highest court in the United States. Naomi believed authority should never announce itself. It should reveal itself through integrity. As she crossed the plaza, she paused beside a small memorial engraved with the words, "Equal justice under law." Her fingers rested gently against the cool stone. She had passed those words thousands of times, yet every morning they carried new meaning. Justice, she often reminded her young clerks, was not measured by how the powerful were treated. It was measured by what happened to those who possessed none. Across the street, Officer Ethan Brooks finished his coffee beside a patrol vehicle. He watched the morning crowd with practiced suspicion. His personnel file described him as proactive. His supervisors praised his confidence. His colleagues admired his willingness to act without hesitation. But buried beneath years of commendations were complaints that never seemed to survive internal review. Excessive force, unprofessional conduct, racial profiling. Witnesses changed their stories. Reports disappeared. Investigations quietly closed. Each dismissal convinced Ethan of the same dangerous lesson. He was untouchable. The badge did not simply protect him. In his mind, it justified him. As Naomi continued toward the secured entrance, Ethan barely glanced at the official access schedule clipped to his clipboard. He trusted his instincts far more than paperwork. His eyes scanned faces instead of credentials, deciding who looked important and who did not. Some decisions take years to build. Others take only a heartbeat to destroy everything. Neither of them knew that within the next few minutes, two completely different worlds would collide on those marble steps. One had been built upon quiet dignity, the other upon unchecked authority. Before the sun disappeared that evening, only one of those foundations would still be standing. Power rarely announces its arrival with raised voices. More often, it reveals itself through quiet habits that no one thinks to question. Officer Ethan Brooks had built those habits over 20 years, one encounter at a time, until confidence hardened into certainty and certainty slowly transformed into arrogance. He knew every corner surrounding the courthouse. He knew which tourists asked too many questions, which protesters returned every month, which attorneys rushed because they were always late. He believed he could read people within seconds. Most days, no one challenged that belief. His partner, Officer Daniel Reeves, leaned against the patrol vehicle while scrolling through incident reports on a tablet. "You've been staring at that entrance for 10 minutes, Daniel said with a faint grin. Ethan shrugged. Something feels off today. Daniel looked toward the marble steps. I see lawyers. I see people pretending to be lawyers. Daniel laughed. You ever think you overanalyze things? No. The answer came too quickly. Years earlier, Ethan might have questioned himself before acting. Promotions, commendations, and repeated praise from supervisors had erased that hesitation. Every successful stop reinforced the same dangerous instinct. Trust yourself first, verify later. Unfortunately, instinct without humility often mistakes prejudice for experience. Across the plaza, Naomi Carter stopped briefly to greet one of the courthouse custodians. Good morning, Mrs. Carter, the elderly man said warmly. She smiled. And good morning to you, Mr. Alvarez. How is her granddaughter? His face brightened. She starts college next month. She'll do wonderful things. The conversation lasted barely 20 seconds, yet everyone who knew Naomi recognized the same quiet quality in her. She remembered names, families, birthdays, small victories that others forgot. Respect flowed naturally from her because she gave it long before she expected it in return. As she continued walking, several law clerks noticed her from a distance. One whispered, Justice Carter's here early. Another nodded respectfully, but made no effort to interrupt her peaceful walk. She appreciated mornings before official business began. Those few silent minutes reminded her why the institution mattered more than any individual serving inside it. Not everyone shared that philosophy. Ethan watched the brief exchange with narrowed eyes. See that, he muttered. Daniel glanced over. What? People acting nervous around her. They looked respectful. They looked rehearsed. Daniel frowned. Or maybe they simply know her. Ethan dismissed the thought before it had a chance to grow. His attention shifted toward Naomi's leather briefcase. Old, unremarkable, no official markings, no visible credentials, nothing that fit the image he expected important people to project. Appearances had always influenced his judgment more than evidence. That flaw had never truly cost him before. A courthouse security officer stepped outside, speaking quietly into an earpiece while scanning the entrance. He spotted Naomi from across the plaza and instinctively straightened his posture. Before he could walk toward her, another group of visitors blocked his path, forcing him into an unexpected delay. Only 30 seconds. Sometimes history changes because of half a minute. Naomi continued forward, unaware that every step shortened the distance between herself and Ethan Brooks. The courthouse clock struck 9. Its deep chime rolled across the plaza like a warning no one understood. Daniel slipped his tablet under his arm. I'm grabbing another coffee. Ethan barely heard him. His eyes never left Naomi. For reasons he could not explain, he had already decided she was someone who needed to be stopped. And once Ethan Brooks made up his mind, almost nothing had ever convinced him to change it. There is a moment in every abuse of power when the victim realizes words will no longer change what is about to happen. Naomi Carter recognized that moment the instant Officer Ethan Brooks stepped into her path. Ma'am, stop right there. His voice was loud enough to draw attention from everyone within earshot. Naomi stopped without protest. She looked at him calmly, waiting for him to continue. I need to see your identification. His hand rested casually near his duty belt. His posture suggested the conversation had already ended before it began. Naomi offered a polite smile. Certainly. My credentials are inside my briefcase. She reached slowly toward the worn leather handle. Don't move. The command echoed across the plaza. Several pedestrians turned instinctively. Naomi froze exactly where she stood. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Officer Ethan stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. I said, don't reach into the bag. I was simply doing what you asked. I'll decide what you do. The words landed with unmistakable authority. A young law student standing nearby exchanged an uneasy glance with her classmate. An older couple visiting from Ohio quietly stopped to watch. Across the plaza, two journalists lowered their conversation as one discreetly activated the camera on his phone. No one knew how significant those recordings would soon become. Naomi maintained steady eye contact. I understand your concern, she said evenly. If you prefer, I'll wait while another officer verifies my identity. Her calmness only seemed to irritate Ethan further. Answer my questions. I intend to. Then tell me why you're entering a restricted area. I have official business inside. What business? I'm afraid I can't discuss confidential court matters in a public plaza. Ethan let out a short, sarcastic laugh. Convenient answer. Daniel Reeves had not yet returned with coffee. There was no partner nearby to soften the encounter. Only Ethan. Only Naomi. Only a growing audience. Imagine standing there, surrounded by strangers, knowing that every word you choose could either inflame the situation or preserve your dignity. Some people answer anger with anger. Others understand that composure is sometimes the strongest form of courage. Naomi chose silence. Ethan mistook it for weakness. He stepped closer again. So you're refusing to cooperate? I've refused nothing. Then identify yourself. I will, once you allow me to retrieve my identification safely. Instead of answering, Ethan reached forward and seized her wrist to prevent her from opening the briefcase. The leather case slipped from her hand. It struck the marble with a dull thud. The clasp sprang open. Legal documents spilled across the ground, carried several feet by a light morning breeze. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. One little boy instinctively bent down to help gather the papers, but his mother gently pulled him back. No, she whispered. Just wait. Naomi looked down at the scattered pages. Then she slowly lifted her eyes toward Ethan. There was disappointment in her expression. Not fear, not anger, only disappointment. You should release my wrist, officer. Her voice remained soft, measured, respectful. For the first time, Ethan noticed that she had addressed him by rank. Yet instead of questioning how she knew it, he tightened his grip, convinced he was asserting control. He never realized that dozens of witnesses had just watched a routine stop become something far more serious. And somewhere inside the courthouse, someone had already noticed that Justice Naomi Carter had not arrived for a meeting she had never once been late to. The most dangerous mistakes are rarely stopped by the people who recognize them first. They're stopped by the evidence those people quietly choose to preserve. Officer Ethan Brooks still held Naomi Carter's wrist, not tightly enough to leave bruises, but firmly enough to leave no doubt that she was no longer free to walk away. The plaza had grown unusually quiet. People who had been hurrying to morning meetings suddenly found reasons to slow down. Conversations faded into whispers. Nearly every pair of eyes remained fixed on the unfolding scene. Naomi stood without resistance. Her breathing remained slow. Her shoulders relaxed. The composure she carried unsettled more than one witness. Most people confronted with public humiliation either argued or retreated. She did neither. Instead, she simply waited. Across the entrance, courthouse security supervisor Michael Grant stepped out of the building after receiving a routine radio update. His eyes scanned the plaza with practiced efficiency before stopping on the small gathering near the barricades. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then he noticed the gray room clock. Justice Carter was never late. Never. She checked her phone. No message. Another clerk looked toward the courtroom windows overlooking the plaza. What is that crowd? Within seconds, 2 staff members hurried toward the entrance. Back outside, Ethan remained convinced he controlled the situation. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Naomi answered softly. I don't believe I am. You've attracted quite an audience. I didn't ask anyone to stop. He looked around. Sure enough, several people were openly recording. A young journalist lowered his phone for a moment and quietly whispered to his cameraman. Keep rolling. Nearby, an elderly veteran shook his head without saying a word. A law professor, standing at the edge of the crowd, folded his arms, watching every detail with growing concern. No one interrupted. Not because they approved, because something about the woman facing Ethan suggested she did not need rescuing. Meanwhile, dozens of silent witnesses were becoming something far more powerful than spectators. They were becoming evidence. Above them, security cameras continued their uninterrupted recording. Traffic cameras overlooked the intersection. A courthouse entrance camera faced directly toward the confrontation. A tourist live-streamed unknowingly to hundreds of viewers. Every angle told the same story. No edits. No missing context. Only truth. Michael Grant reached the edge of the crowd. His pace slowed. His heartbeat did not. For nearly 15 years, he had greeted Justice Naomi Carter almost every morning. There was no possibility of mistaken identity. He opened his mouth to speak, then stopped. Protocol mattered. Public confrontation between law enforcement officers required careful handling. One careless move could escalate everything. Instead, he quietly reached for his radio. "This is Supervisor Grant." His voice remained calm despite the urgency. "I need the chief marshal at the front entrance immediately." There was a brief pause. "Reason?" Grant never took his eyes off Ethan. "An officer is detaining Justice Naomi Carter." Silence. Then a sharp response. "Repeat that." Grant swallowed. His next words carried the weight of a coming storm. "I said, an officer is detaining Justice Naomi Carter." Inside the courthouse, doors began opening. Footsteps echoed through marble hallways. The machinery of justice had finally realized that one of its own had disappeared. And outside, Officer Ethan Brooks still had absolutely no idea who was standing in front of him. Truth does not rush. It advances with quiet footsteps until there is nowhere left for lies to hide. Officer Ethan Brooks finally noticed a change in the crowd. People were no longer watching with curiosity. They were watching with certainty. Their expressions had shifted from confusion to disbelief, as though everyone knew something he did not. He frowned. "What are you all looking at?" No one answered. Naomi Carter remained motionless, her wrist still in his grasp. She neither struggled nor attempted to pull away. Her silence carried a confidence that Ethan could not explain. Then footsteps echoed across the marble plaza. Measured, purposeful, urgent. Chief Marshal Rebecca Lawson emerged from the courthouse entrance, followed by 2 deputy marshals and several senior court officials. Their pace was brisk, but their faces remained composed. Years of protecting one of the nation's most important institutions had taught them never to panic in public. The crowd instinctively parted. Lawson's eyes immediately found Naomi. For a brief moment, concern crossed her face. Then she looked at Ethan. "Officer." Her voice was calm. "Please release Justice Carter immediately." The words seemed to suspend time itself. Ethan blinked. "I'm sorry, who?" "Justice Naomi Carter." Silence. Even the traffic beyond the plaza seemed distant. Ethan looked back at Naomi as if seeing her for the first time. His eyes searched her face for some sign that this was a misunderstanding. There was none. Naomi simply met his gaze with the same quiet dignity she had carried since the encounter began. "I don't understand," Ethan said. Lawson stepped closer. "You are currently detaining an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court." Several audible gasps rose from the surrounding crowd. One reporter lowered his microphone in astonishment. Another immediately began speaking into a live broadcast. "This is unbelievable." Daniel Reeves had just returned with 2 cups of coffee. He froze the instant he recognized Chief Marshal Lawson. One paper cup slipped from his hand. Coffee splashed across the pavement unnoticed. "Ethan," Daniel whispered. "What did you do?" For the first time that morning, uncertainty appeared on Ethan's face. He slowly released Naomi's wrist. I was only conducting a security check." Naomi gently adjusted the sleeve of her coat where his hand had been. "I never objected to a security check, officer." Her voice remained steady. "I objected only to being prevented from complying with it." Those few words carried more weight than any accusation. Lawson bent down and carefully gathered one of the scattered legal documents from the marble floor. She glanced at the cover before handing it respectfully back to Naomi. "I'm deeply sorry, Justice." Naomi accepted the folder with a small nod. "Thank you. No anger. No humiliation. Only grace." That grace somehow made the moment even more devastating, because every witness could now compare the behavior of the 2 people standing at the center of the plaza. One had possessed authority. The other had demonstrated character. High above them, News helicopters have begun circling downtown after reports of an unfolding incident outside the Supreme Court. Television producers were already requesting surveillance footage. Social media clips were spreading faster than anyone could measure. Ethan looked around at the dozens of phones still pointed toward him. The realization finally reached him. Every decision, every word, every assumption had been recorded. The badge that had always shielded him could not erase a single frame of what had just happened. And somewhere inside the courthouse, the institution he believed he had protected was preparing to ask a far more difficult question. Not whether Justice Naomi Carter belonged there, but whether Officer Ethan Brooks still deserved the authority he had carried for 20 years. The collapse of a reputation is rarely marked by shouting. More often, it begins with a single realization: that everyone else has already reached the truth before you have. Officer Ethan Brooks stood motionless. His hand, once so confident on Naomi Carter's wrist, now hung awkwardly at his side. The authority he had projected only moments earlier seemed to dissolve beneath dozens of silent eyes. No one spoke. No one needed to. Chief Marshal Rebecca Lawson stepped beside Justice Carter. "Are you injured, Justice?" Naomi glanced briefly at the faint redness around her wrist before answering. "I'm fine." She said nothing more. She did not ask for Ethan's badge. She did not demand an apology. She did not raise her voice. That restraint unsettled Ethan far more than anger ever could, because he suddenly understood that the story was no longer his to control. Supervisor Michael Grant approached, carrying Naomi's leather briefcase, now carefully closed. Every document had been gathered by court staff with meticulous attention, ensuring that not a single page remained on the marble steps. "I'm terribly sorry, Justice," Grant said quietly. Naomi accepted the briefcase. "Thank you, Michael." She remembered his name. Even now, even after everything that had happened. Several witnesses exchanged glances. Kindness under pressure possessed a remarkable kind of strength. Meanwhile, courthouse communications staff hurried toward the entrance, speaking urgently into secure radios. Legal advisors emerged from nearby offices. Uniformed marshals established a respectful perimeter, not to hide what had happened, but to preserve the scene exactly as it had unfolded. Evidence mattered. Facts mattered. Inside the Supreme Court building, scheduled meetings quietly came to a halt. Word spread from office to office with astonishing speed. Justice Carter had been publicly detained outside the court. Every hallway seemed to grow quieter. Every conversation turned toward the same question. How could this have happened? Outside, Daniel Reeves finally stepped beside Ethan. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "You need to stop talking." Ethan looked at him, confused. "I didn't know who she was." Daniel's expression remained grim. "That's not the problem." Those 6 words struck harder than anything Chief Marshal Lawson could have said, because Daniel understood what Ethan still struggled to accept. Identity was never the real issue. Respect was. Had Naomi truly been an ordinary attorney, an administrative assistant, a visitor, a teacher, or simply a citizen walking toward work, nothing about Ethan's conduct would have been acceptable. The title had exposed the mistake. It had not created it. That realization settled over the crowd with quiet clarity. Nearby, one young law student lowered her phone after recording nearly the entire encounter. She turned to her professor. "I thought justice was protected by buildings." The professor looked toward the towering marble columns. "No," he answered softly. "Justice is protected by people willing to defend it." Across the street, news vans began arriving one after another. Satellite dishes slowly unfolded toward the sky. Producers directed camera crews into position. What had started as a routine morning stop was rapidly becoming a national story. Chief Marshal Lawson finally addressed Ethan again. "Officer Brooks." He looked up. "You will remain here until your department's command staff arrives." The statement was calm, professional, final. For the first time in his career, Ethan realized that he was no longer the person conducting the investigation. He had become its subject. And as Justice Naomi Carter quietly walked through the courthouse doors without another word, The massive bronze entrance closed behind her with a deep echo that seemed to separate two different worlds. One belonged to authority. The other belonged to accountability. By the time that door finished closing, Officer Ethan Brooks was standing alone on the wrong side of both. Justice is not measured by the moment a mistake is exposed. It is measured by what a society chooses to do after the truth can no longer be denied. Within an hour, the story had spread far beyond the marble steps of the Supreme Court. Television networks interrupted regular programming. News anchors repeated the same question. How had a sitting justice of the United States Supreme Court been publicly detained outside her own workplace? Yet the deeper question was even more unsettling. Would the outcome have been any different if she had not been a justice? Inside police headquarters, the atmosphere had changed completely. Officer Ethan Brooks sat alone in a conference room. His duty belt rested on the table. His service weapon had been secured according to department procedure. No one had accused him of a crime. Not yet, but administrative investigations begin long before conclusions are reached. A captain entered carrying a thin folder. He closed the door quietly. "Ethan," the officer looked up. "We've placed you on administrative leave effective immediately." Ethan swallowed. "I was following protocol." The captain did not argue. Instead, he opened the folder. Inside were printed photographs, video stills, witness statements, timeline reports, body camera timestamps, evidence gathered in less than 60 minutes. "You'll have every opportunity to explain your decisions," the captain said calmly. "But understand this." He slid one photograph across the table. It showed Naomi standing peacefully while Ethan gripped her wrist. "This isn't about what happened after you learned who she was." He placed another image beside it. "This is about everything that happened before." Those words lingered in the silence. Across town, Justice Naomi Carter had resumed her scheduled duties. She entered the conference room exactly as she had done hundreds of times before. Several fellow justices stood as she arrived, not because protocol required it, because respect did. One justice quietly asked, "Are you all right?" Naomi smiled gently. "I will be." Then she opened her case files and began discussing constitutional questions as though the morning had not belonged to her at all. Duty came before emotion. It always had. Outside the court, however, the nation continued watching. The first cell phone video surpassed 1 million views before lunchtime. Legal analysts paused the footage frame by frame. Former judges discussed professional standards. Retired police commanders debated proper procedure. Civil rights advocates reminded audiences that the issue extended far beyond one officer and one justice. Every ordinary citizen deserved the same dignity. No exceptions. Back at headquarters, Ethan requested to review the recordings himself. The captain nodded. A monitor flickered to life. There he was, confident, certain, interrupting, commanding, grabbing her wrist. Watching the footage from his own perspective had never forced him to confront the full picture. Watching it through the eyes of everyone else did. He noticed details he had ignored in the moment. Her calm voice, his interruptions, the growing discomfort on bystanders' faces, the opportunities he had been given to de-escalate. Each one passed by, each one rejected. When the video finally ended, the room remained silent. The captain turned off the monitor. "No one's asking whether you recognized Justice Carter." Ethan stared at the blank screen. "They're asking why you stopped seeing her as a person before you ever knew who she was." For the first time since that morning began, Officer Ethan Brooks found himself without a single answer. And outside the conference room, the investigation was no longer searching for one man's mistake. It was searching for every belief that had quietly allowed that mistake to happen in the first place. Power can open a door. Character determines what happens after you walk through it. 3 weeks after the incident, the marble steps outside the Supreme Court looked exactly as they always had. Tourists gathered for photographs. Law clerks hurried toward morning arguments. Police officers continued their patrols. At first glance, nothing had changed. But places remember. Sometimes, they remember through the people who choose never to repeat the same mistake. Justice Naomi Carter climbed those familiar steps with the same quiet pace she had carried throughout her career. She never spoke publicly about that morning. She never appeared on television. She never accepted invitations to tell her story. When reporters asked for interviews, her office issued only one sentence. The rule of law is strongest when it protects every person equally. Nothing more. She understood something many people never do. True dignity does not demand the final word. It allows actions to speak long after voices have grown silent. Across the city, Officer Ethan Brooks no longer wore his badge. Following an internal investigation, witness interviews, and the review of multiple recordings, the department concluded that his conduct had violated both professional standards and the principles he had sworn to uphold. His career ended not because one powerful person objected. It ended because the evidence showed how he had treated another human being before he knew who she was. That distinction mattered. It always would. Daniel Reeves remained with the department. The experience changed him as well. New officers often found him repeating a simple lesson during field training. Never assume someone's worth before you know their name. Many recruits believed he was teaching tactics. In truth, he was teaching character. Months later, a small plaque appeared inside the department's training academy. It did not mention Ethan Brooks. It did not mention Justice Naomi Carter. Instead, it carried a single sentence. Authority earns trust only when it begins with respect. Every graduating class walked past those words. Some barely noticed them. Others stopped to read them twice. The difference would shape the kind of officers they became. One autumn afternoon, Naomi happened to pass through the same plaza where everything had begun. The marble reflected the golden afternoon light. A young police cadet recognized her immediately. He approached with quiet humility. "Justice Carter?" She smiled. "Yes." The cadet hesitated. "I just wanted to thank you." She looked at him curiously. "For what?" He glanced toward the courthouse steps. "Our instructors showed us the footage from that day." He lowered his eyes. "They told us that professionalism begins long before someone shows us a title." Naomi's expression softened. "I hope they also told you something else." The cadet waited. "Every person you meet is carrying a story you cannot see." He nodded slowly. "I'll remember that. I believe you will." She wished him well and continued walking toward the courthouse. The young cadet remained standing for a long moment, watching her disappear through the bronze doors. Perhaps that was how justice truly echoed, not through revenge, not through humiliation, but through lives quietly changed because someone chose dignity instead of bitterness. Imagine standing where Ethan Brooks once stood. Imagine believing that a uniform alone defined authority. Now, imagine discovering that real authority had been standing calmly in front of you all along. He wore a badge. She carried the Constitution in both duty and spirit. He believed power gave him the right to judge. She proved that character is what gives justice its voice. And in the end, the greatest verdict was never announced inside a courtroom. It was written forever in the simple truth that respect should never depend on knowing who someone is before choosing to treat them as fully human.